Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition, and today we're going to be continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And sorry about the glare. I think it's my light here. Okay. Well, we're moving quite along. This is chapter 14, and this will be part one. And I hope you're enjoying this because I am. And be sure to check out our other book clubs. Let me move the camera in just a little bit here so you guys can see. If you have a book, you can follow with us there. If you don't, you can follow with us on the camera. And check out our other book clubs as well. We have uh, the spiritual book club on Mondays and health book clubs on Wednesdays. And we've got we got merch and all kinds of stuff on our website. So anyways, check them out and check out our YouTube channel. Okay, that's my 10 seconds of self-indulging, whatever you call it, advertisement. Okay, here we go. Chapter 14, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. The coup d'etat in Russia, in which the Bolshevik minority seized control from the revolutionary majority, the role played by New York financiers masquerading as Red Cross officials in supporting the Bolsheviks, the unbroken record since then of American assistance in building Russia's war-making potential, the emergence of a, quote, credible enemy in accordance with the Rothschild formula. In the previous section, we saw that the Red Cross mission in revolutionary Russia was, in the words of its own personnel, nothing but a mask. This leads to the logical question, what were the true motives and goals that were hidden behind that mask? In later years, it would be explained by the participants themselves that they simply were engaged in a humanitarian effort to keep Russia in the war against Germany, and thus to help the cause of freedom for England and her allies. For Jacob Schiff and other Jewish financiers in New York, there was the additional explanation that they opposed the Tsar because of his anti-Semitism. This, of course, are admirable motives, and they have been uncritically accepted by mainstream historians ever since. Unfortunately, the official explanations do not square with the facts. Russia's two revolutions. The facts are that there were two revolutions in Russia that year, not one. The first, called the February Revolution, resulted in the establishment of a provisional socialist government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. It was relatively moderate in its policies and attempted to accommodate all revolutionary factions, including the Bolsheviks, who were the smallest minority. When the February Revolution occurred, Lenin and Trotsky were not even in Russia. Lenin was in Switzerland and didn't arrive until April. Trotsky was still in New York, writing propaganda and giving speeches. The second revolution, called the October Revolution, I think that was the more famous one, the October Revolution, was the one through which the Bolsheviks came to power. It was, in fact, no revolution at all. It was a coup d'etat. The Bolsheviks simply took advantage of the confusion and indecisiveness that existed among the various groups that comprised the new government and caught them by surprise with a lightning strike of force. With a combination of bribes and propaganda, they recruited several regiments of soldiers and sailors, and in the early morning darkness of October 25, methodically took military possession of all government buildings and communication centers. No one was prepared for such audacity, and resistance was almost non-existent. By dawn, without the Russian people even knowing what had happened, much less having any voice in that action, their country had been captured by a minority faction and became the world's first so-called, quote, People's Republic. Within 2 days, Kerensky had fled for his life, and all provisional government ministers had been arrested. That is how the communists seized Russia, and that is how they held it afterwards. Contrary to the Marxian myth, they have never represented the people. They simply have the guns. The ones with the big guns win, right? The basic facts of this so-called revolution are described by Professor Leonard Shapiro in his authoritative work, The Russian Revolutions of 1917. All the evidence suggests that when the crisis came, the great majority of units of the Petrograd garrison did not support the government but simply remained neutral. The Cossack units rejected its call for support, leaving the government with only a few hundred women soldiers and around 2,000 military cadets in its side. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, could count on several regiments to carry out their orders. Units of the Baltic Fleet also supported them. In the event, the Bolshevik takeover was almost bloodless. In contrast with what had happened in February, nothing could have been less like a city in the throes of revolution than Petrograd on 25 October. Crowds of well-dressed people thronged the streets in the evening. Theaters and restaurants were open, and at the gate, Shaliapin sang the Boris Godunov. The principal stations and services had all been taken over by the morning of 25 October without a shot being fired. A battleship and several cruisers, including the Aurora, had reached Petrograd from Kronstadt and were anchored with their guns trained on targets in the city. The provisional government inside the Winter Palace received an ultimatum calling for surrender of its members, under threat of bombardment of the palace by Aurora and by the guns of the Peter and Paul fortress. It was only at 9:40 p.m. that the Aurora was ordered to fire and discharge one blank shell. The main effect of this was to accelerate the thinning out of the cadet defenders of the palace, who had already begun to dwindle. The women soldiers who had formed part of its defense force also left before the palace was invaded. At 11 p.m., some live shells were fired, and the palace was slightly damaged. The story of the dramatic storming of the Winter Palace, popular with Soviet historians and in the cinema, is a myth. At around 2 a.m. on 26 October, a small detachment of troops, followed by an unruly crowd and led by two members of the MRC, the Military Revolutionary Committee, entered the palace. The remaining officer cadets were apparently prepared to resist, but were ordered to surrender by the ministers. In the end, the total casualties were 3 officer cadets wounded. And that was from Leonard Shapiro, The Russian Revolutions of 1917, New York Basic Books, 1984, page 135 and 136. Popular, oh, sorry about that. Okay. Popular support was not necessary. Eugene Lyons had been a correspondent for United Press in revolutionary Russia. He began his career as highly sympathetic to the Bolsheviks and their new regime. But 6 years of actual living inside the new socialist utopia shattered its illusions. In his acclaimed book, Workers' Paradise Lost, he summarizes the true meaning of the October Revolution. Lenin, Trotsky, and their cohorts did not overthrow the monarchy. They overthrew the first democratic society in Russian history, set up through a truly popular revolution in March 1917. They represented the smallest of the Russian radical movements, but theirs was a movement that scoffed at numbers and frankly mistrusted the multitudes. The workers could be educated for their role after the revolution. They would not be led but driven to their terrestrial heaven. Lenin always sneered at the obsession of competing socialist groups with their, quote, mass base. Give us an organization of professional revolutionaries, he used to say, and we will turn Russia upside down. Even these contingents were pathetically duped, having not the remotest notion of the real purposes for which they were being used. They were striking out, they thought, for the multi-party socialists. For the multi-party Soviets, for freedom, equality, and other goals which the organizers regarded as emotional garbage. On the brink of the dictatorship, Lenin dared to promise that the state will fade away, since, quote, all need of force will vanish, end quote, not at some remote future, but at once. Quote, the proletarian state begins to wither immediately after its triumph, for in a classless society, a state is unnecessary and impossible. Soviet power is a new kind of state in which there is no bureaucracy, no police, no standing army. Also, so long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. Interesting, isn't it? When there is freedom, there is no state. Within a few months after they attained power, most of the czarist practices the Leninists had condemned were revived, usually in more ominous forms: political prisoners, convictions without trial, and without the formality of charges, savage prosecution of dissenting views, death penalties for more varieties of crime than in any other modern nation. The rest were put into effect in the following years, including the suppression of all other parties, restoration of the internal passport, a state monopoly of the press, along with repressive practices the monarchy had outlived for a century or more. And that quote was from Eugene Lyon's Workers' Paradise Lost, New York Funk and Wagnalls, or sorry, Wagnalls, 1967, page 13 to 29. Notes from Lincoln Steffen's diary. That this was the prevailing motives of the New York money powers was clearly brought to light in the diary of Lincoln Steffens, one of America's best-known leftist writers of that time. Steffens was on board the SS Christiania for what? Christiania for what? Chris Christiania Christiania for George? What? Anyways, whatever. How weird. Okay. When Trotsky was taken off and arrested in Halifax, he carefully wrote down the conversations he had with other passengers who also were headed to strife-torn Russia. One of these was Charles Crane, vice president of the Crane Company. Crane was a backer of Woodrow Wilson and former chairman of the Democratic Party's Finance Committee. He also had organized the Westinghouse Company in Russia and had made no fewer than 23 prior visits. His son, Richard Crane, was the confidential assistant to then Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. It is instructive, therefore, to read Steffen's notes regarding the views of these traveling companions. He wrote, quote, all agree that the revolution is in its first phase only, that it must grow. Crane and the Russian radicals on the ship think we shall be in Petrograd for the revolution. And that quote was from Lincoln Steffens, The Letters of Lincoln Steffens, New York Harcourt Brace, 1941, page 396. Precisely. Revolution was the expectation and the goal, not the elimination of anti-Semitism. With regard to Trump, sorry, a little tongue twisted here this morning. I have a lot of respect for people who read professionally. That's a lot of work. Anyways, my hat's off to them. With regard to Thompson's claim that he was merely trying to keep Russia in the war against Germany, here again the logic of actual events speak against it. Kerensky and the provisional government were were for the war effort. Yet the Red Cross masqueraders eventually threw their longest, wow, I think I need new glasses or something. My eyes are getting kind of blurry for some reason. Okay. Let me try that paragraph again. Hmm. With regard to Thompson's claim that he was merely trying to keep Russia in the war against Germany, here again the logic of actual events speak against it. Kerensky and the provisional government were for the war effort. Yet the Red Cross masqueraders eventually threw their strongest support to the Bolsheviks who were against it. Their excuse was that it was obvious the Bolsheviks would soon control the new government and they were merely looking to the future. They did not like the Bolsheviks, they said, but had to deal with them pragmatically. So they became staunch supporters merely to gain influence with the inevitable victors and hopefully to persuade them to change their position on the war. Yeah, like that's going to work. Alas, it didn't work out that way. Influence they had, as we have seen, but the Bolsheviks were never wavered in their views. After seizing control in the October coup d'etat, they did exactly what they claimed all along they would do. They signed a peace treaty with Germany and confiscated private property. They also began one of the world's greatest bloodbaths to eliminate their opposition. None of this could be blamed on the masqueraders, you understand. It was all the fault of Wilson and the other politicians at home, who, by not following Thompson's recommendation to send US tax dollars to the Bolsheviks, forced them into such drastic action. That, at least, is the accepted view. In reality, a Bolshevik victory at that time was anything but certain. And there was little reason beyond the support given by the New York financiers themselves to believe they would become the dominant voice of Russia. But even if we grant the assumption that these men were unusually astute political observers who were truly able to foresee the future course, we are still faced with serious obstacles, not the least of which are the thoughts and words of the masqueraders themselves. For example, in February of 1918, Arthur Bullard was in Russia as head of the Russian branch of the Committee on Public Information, which was the war propaganda arm of the US government. Bullard was aptly described by historian George Cannon as a, quote, liberal socialist, freelance writer, and private eye of Colonel House, end quote. And that quote was from George F. Kennan, The Decision to Intervene, Soviet-American Relations, 1917 to 1920, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1958, page 190 and page 190 and 235. Oh boy, that's a lot of energy going on today. I feel kind of off off-centered this morning. In his official capacity, he had many occasions to consult with Raymond Robbins, and in a report describing one of these conversations, Bullard wrote, he, Robbins, had one or two reservations, in particular that recognition of the Bolsheviks was long overdue, that it should have been effected immediately, and that had the U.S. so recognized the Bolsheviks, I believe we would now be in control of the surplus resources of Russia and have control officers at all points on the frontier. End quote. And that was from Bullard MS. I don't know what that means. U.S. State Department decimal file 316-11-1265, March 19, 1918. Wolves behind the mask. The following year, the U.S. Senate conducted an investigation into the role played by prominent American citizens in supporting the Bolsheviks' rise to power. One of the documents entered into the record was an early communique from Robbins to Bruce Lockhart. In it, Robbins said, you will hear it said that I am an agent of Wall Street, that I am the servant of William B. Thompson to get Altai copper for him. Is that a person's name? Altai Copper? Sounds like a stage name. Altai Copper? I don't know. Okay, whatever. Um, that I have already got 500,000 acres of the best timberland in Russia for myself, that I have already copped off the Trans-Siberian Railway, that they have given me a monopoly of a platinum in Russia, that this explains my working for the Soviet. You will hear all that. You will hear that talk. Now, I do not think that is true, Commissioner, but let us assume it is true. Let us assume that I am here to capture Russia for Wall Street, an American businessman. Let us assume that you are a British wolf and I am an American wolf, and that when this war is over, we're going to eat each other up for the Russian market. Let us do so in perfectly frank man fashion, but let us assume at the same time that we're fairly intelligent wolves, and that we know that if we do not hunt together in this hour, the German wolf will eat us both up. That's funny. U.S. Congress, and that was from U.S. Congress, Senate, Bolshevik Propaganda, Subcommittee of the Committee on the Judiciary, 25th Congress, 1919, page 802. Professor Sutton has placed all this into perspective. In the following passage, he is speaking specifically about Robin Thompson. Oh, sorry, William Thompson. But his remarks apply with equal force to Robbins and all of the other financiers who were part of the Red Cross mission in Russia. Thompson's motives were primarily financial and commercial. Specifically, Thompson was interested in the Russian market and how this market could be influenced, diverted, and captured for post-war exploitation by a Wall Street syndicate or syndicates. Certainly, Thompson viewed Germany as an enemy, but less a political enemy than an economic or a commercial enemy. German industry and German banking were the real enemy. To outwit Germany, Thompson was willing to place seed money on any political power vehicle that would achieve its objectives. That would achieve his objectives. In other words, Thompson was an American imperialist fighting against German imperialism, and this struggle was shrewdly recognized and exploited by Lenin and Trotsky. Thompson was not a Bolshevik. He was not even pro-Bolshevik. Neither was he pro-Kerensky, nor was he even pro-American. The overriding motivation was the capturing of the post-war Russian market. So in other words, he's in it for his own egotistical benefit, selfish benefit. This was a commercial objective. Ideology could sway revolutionary operators like Kerensky, Trotsky, Lenin et al., but not financiers. And that quote was from Sutton, Revolution, page 97, 98. Did the wolves of the Round Table actually succeed in their goal? Did they, in fact, capture the surplus resources of Russia? The answer to that question will not be found in our history books. It must be tracked down along the trail of subsequent events, and what we must look for is this. If the plan had not been successful, we would expect to find a decline of interest on the part of high finance, if not outright hostility. On the other hand, if it did succeed, we would expect to see not only continued support, but some evidence of profit taken by the investors, a payback for their efforts and their risk. With those footprints as our guide, let us turn now to an overview of what was actually happened since the Bolsheviks were assisted to power by the Round Table Network. Item. After the October Revolution, all the banks in Russia were taken over and, quote, nationalized by the Bolsheviks, except one, the Petrograd branch of Rockefeller's National City Bank. Item. Heavy industry in Russia was also nationalized, except the Westinghouse plant, which had been established by Charles Crane, one of the dignitaries aboard the SS, oh boy, that word again, Christiania, Christiania Jord. Jord. I think the J is silent. Uh, Christiania Niaf Jord. I'm sorry I butchered that name. I think that was, what language is that? Oh, slipped my mind. I'm having a brain fart this morning. Anyways, who had traveled to Russia with Trotsky to witness the re-revolution? Item, page 19, oh, sorry. In 1922, the Soviets formed their first international bank. Okay. It was not owned and run by the state as would be dictated by communist theory, but was put together by a syndicate of private bankers. These included not only former Tsarist bankers, but representatives of German, Swedish, and American banks. So they're creating another cartel, an international cartel. They've taken the Federal Reserve, which is local to the United States, they've really expanded it and uh, did it internationally this time, isn't it? Um, so this was 1922. Federal Reserve was what, 1913? So within 10, 13 years? I don't, I'm not good with math in my head, sorry, but a little bit over 10 years. Wow, that's fast. Sorry, I got distracted there. Most of the foreign capital came from England, including the British government itself. And that was from U.S. State Department decimal file 861.516/129, August 28, 1922. The man appointed as director of the foreign division of the new bank was Max May, vice president of Morgan's Guaranty Trust Company in New York. Item. In the years immediately following the October Revolution, there was a steady stream of large and lucrative, read less competitive contracts issued by the Soviets to British and American businesses, which were directly or indirectly run by the Round Table Network. The largest of these, for example, was a contract for 50 million pounds of food products to Morris and Company, Chicago meat packers. Edward Morris was married to Helen Swift, whose brother was Harold Swift. Harold Swift had been a, quote, major at the Red Cross mission in Russia. Item. In payment for these contracts and to return the, quote, loans of the financiers, the Bolsheviks all but drained their country of its gold, which included the Tsarist government's sizable reserve, and shipped it primarily to American and British banks. In 1920 alone, one shipment came to the US through Stockholm valued at 39 million Swedish kroner. These three shipments came direct, involving 540 boxes of gold, valued at 97,200,000 gold rupees, plus at least one other direct shipment, bringing the total to about $20 million. Remember, these are 1920 values. Wow. It's probably trillions of dollars in today's value, which is 2025. The arrival of these shipments was coordinated by Jacob Schiff's Kuhn, Loeb and Company and deposited by Morgan's Guaranty Trust. And that was from U.S. State Department decimal file 861.51/815, 836, 837, October 1920. Also Sutton, Revolution, page 159 to 160 and page 165. Item. It was at about this time that the Wilson administration sent 700,000 tons of food to the Soviet Union, which not only saved the regime from certain collapse, but gave Lenin the power to consolidate his control over all of Russia. And that quote was from, oh, sorry, that footnote was from George F. Kennan, Russia and the West under Lenin and Stalin. Boston, Little Brown and Company, 1961, page 180. The U.S. Food Administration, which handled this giant operation, was handsomely profitable for those commercial enterprises that participated. It was headed by Herbert Hoover and directed by Louis Lichtenstein Strauss, married to Alice Annauer, daughter of one of the partners of Kuhn Loeb and Company. They're all in cahoots with each other, isn't it? Item, US, British, and German wolves soon found a bonanza of profit in selling to the new Soviet regime. Standard Oil and General Electric supplied $37 million worth of machinery from 1921 to 1925, and that was just the beginning. Junkers aircraft in German literally created Soviet air power. At least 3 million slave laborers perished in the icy mines of Siberia digging ore for Britain's Lena Goldfields Limited. W. Averill Harriman, a railroad magnate and banker from the United States, who later was to become ambassador to Russia, acquired a 20-year monopoly over all Soviet manganese production. Arm& Hammer, uh, uh, I thought that sounded kind of funny. It's Armand Hammer. Laughing at myself here. Armand Hammer, not the baking soda. Or it could be, I don't know. Interesting, eh? Armand Hammer, close personal friend of Lenin, made one of the world's greatest fortunes by mining Russian asbestos. Additional background: the deaf, mute, blind men. In those early years, the Bolsheviks were desperate for foreign goods, services, and capital punishment. Sorry. Where is my mind going? Capital investment. Let's try that sentence again. In though Probably capital punishment too. Bolsheviks are pretty violent. In those early years, the Bolsheviks were desperate for foreign goods, services, and capital investment. They knew that they would be gouged by their quote capitalist associates. But what of it? It wasn't their money. All they cared about was staying in power. And that was not as easy as it may have seemed. Even after the coup d'etat, in which they seized control of the mechanism of government, they still did not control the country at large. In fact, in 1919, Lenin had almost given up hope of expanding beyond Petrograd, and the Crimea were in the hands of General Denikin, who was strongly anti-communist. Speaking before the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, Lenin laid it out plainly. Without the assistance of capital, it will be impossible for us to retain proletarian power in an incredibly ruined country in which the peasantry, also ruined, constitutes the overwhelming majority. And of course, for this assistance, capital will squeeze hundreds percent out of us. This is what we have to understand. Hence, excuse me. I burped. Hence, either this type of economic relations or nothing. ... And that was from V.I. Lenin. Report to the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, March 15, 1921, quoted by Sutton, Revolution, page 157. Another occasion, Lenin further explained his rationale for accepting Wall Street's terms. He said, "The capitalists of the world and their governments, in pursuit of conquest of the Soviet market, will close their eyes to the indicated higher reality and thus will turn into deaf, mute, blind men. They will extend credits, which will strengthen for us the Communist Party in their countries and giving us the materials and technology we lack. They will restore our military industry, indispensable for our future victorious attack on our suppliers. In other words, they will labor for the preparation of their own suicide." That quote was quoted by Joseph Finder, Red Carpet, New York, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, 1983, page 8. Arthur Bullard, mentioned previously as the representative in Russia of the U.S. Committee on Public Information, apparently understood the Bolshevik strategy well. Even as early as March of 1918, he sent a cablegram to Washington, warning that while it is true we ought to be ready to help any honest government in need, nevertheless, he said, quote, men or money sent to the present rulers of Russia will be used against Russians at least as much as against Germans. I strongly advise against giving material help to the present Russian government. Sinister elements in Soviets seem to be gaining control, end quote. And that was from Arthur Bullard Papers, Princeton University, cited by Sutton, Revolution, page 46. Unfortunately, Mr. Bullard was a minor player in this game, and his opinion was filtered by others along the way. This cablegram was sent to his superior, none other than Colonel Edward Mandell House, in hopes that it would be relayed to the president. The message did not get through. And we will stop here for now. I hope you enjoyed that. It was quite a tale about the Russian Bolsheviks. Anyways, I hope you guys all have a great day. And we're starting a new book next month in August. Actually, two. We're starting a new health book, a book reading for health, and a new book reading for the spiritual edition. So check it out. I'll put the links below. And check out our center and all the goodies we have. Interesting stuff. I try to make it interesting. All right. I hope you guys have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.